Forgot to mention you're well dressed.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you can add that to the next one.
I will.
Yeah, I was looking at it as like, oh, I didn't dress my suit.
Are you doing it?
Sure.
Hi.
All right.
60 seconds. Hi. 45 seconds.
No, we're the Great Plains Institution.
I didn't do it.
Yeah, you were fun.
Oh, yeah. I didn't get family. Did we spot it? We spotted it.
Yeah. Now we won't know who we have. No, like.
Sure.
Email with that.
Spouse and child.
Okay, so that's the same as mine.
Yep.
My son's a nice spouse. Yep.
I'm gonna initial here. Doing good for people. I like that one.
Oh, I already got you. Yep.
I mean, I don't think I got yours yet. Good on yours.
Andy?
Hal. That's my husband.
Okay, and Cora?
My daughter.
Okay.
Yeah. And Hal, that is a good value.
In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So great. So if you can count up how many signatures you're able to get, that would be great.
Total or in each?
Total. So total signatures, even if they're duplicate. From duplicate, I mean the same person more than once. All right. Cool. So how many signatures were folks able to get? You got 14, 21, 26, 18, 15, 17, 12. All right. 8. All right. Cool. Sounds like 26 is the highest number. Sweet. Let's give her a hand. Give her a hand. Let me see. Overachiever messing up the scale. So I can only assume that everyone was able at least to find one person to sign on and one person to sign on your paper, at least.
In every circle?
Or just at least one.
Oh.
At least one circle, right? All right, cool. So as you were walking around the room and you were looking at other people's papers, were there things that you saw in other people's papers and you were like, man, I should have thought about that. Why didn't I write that down? What were some of those things that you saw in other people's papers that you said, I should have wrote this down? Compassion. All right, cool. Social justice. One more. Nature. You saw that. And everyone else was like, I value nature. I should have wrote that down. Right?
We work in the environmental field.
Oh, I didn't mean to put you out there like that.
But in full disclosure, I didn't have it either.
Oh, well, good. Right? And we'll talk about why that might have been missing in just a second. Were there things, though, I think Sandra was hinting at something, that were either difficult to find people to sign on, or you actually did not find someone to sign on one of your circles? What was one of those?
God.
Religion, all right? So if religion, spirituality, connectedness with a being beyond this earthly existence is of value to you or important to you, however you label that, if that's important or of value, please raise your hand high. All right, great. So you're not alone, right? Another person who had difficult finding a circle to get filled, or having someone sign on your circle that either is blank or difficult. Yes? Fun. Please raise your hand if you value fun, even if you're not having it right now. Right? Okay. So you are not alone. Right? One more that was either difficult or blank.
My cat.
Your cat, right? So if animals are important to you, either in your home or in someone else's home, are of value to you, please raise your hand. Great. So what do you think is the obvious lesson of this particular activity? What am I going after by having us do this activity?
There's more commonality than we imagine.
That there's more commonality than we oftentimes imagine, right? We share values. What else?
There are more things we care about than we can immediately think of.
There are more things that we care about than we can immediately think of, right? Do you have more than 5 values?
Yeah.
Obviously, right? Yeah. We obviously have more values. So one of the things that I want to do is help you reframe this conversation about diversity. And it's important that we reframe it, because if we don't, we allow others to frame it for us. When you look at this particular diagram, what do you see? What do you notice? What do you recognize?
Everything's different.
Everything is different. Yes.
Genogram symbols.
That they're genogram symbols. Okay, thank you, social worker. Outing me, right? Of psychology. What else?
There's 3 and 3 and 3. I mean, there's a system there.
There's a system here, right? What else?
They're cross categories.
They're cross categories. They're very much the same, and they are also different. So a new way that I want you to think about diversity is it is about how we are the same, and it is about how we are different at the same time. I don't know about you. How many people have been to a sensitivity training? I've been to sensitivity trainings. Anyone been to cultural competence trainings? Anyone been to sexual harassment trainings? Or just general diversity trainings, right? A lot of times, I don't know about you, but the trainings that I've attended, and sometimes earlier in my career that I've conducted, we spent time talking about one of these dimensions, but never both at the same time. When we talked about how we are so different, we have to respect differences, and differences are important, and they are. But what is equally as important are our commonalities. Because as human beings, we're much more alike than we are dissimilar. And I would suggest that there is something that is trying to confuse us, that I will call obstacle illusions. Obstacle illusions. Artificial barriers to authentic human relations. Obstacle illusions. And one of those obstacle illusions we will call race. It's an obstacle illusion, and we'll spend more time talking about obstacle illusions. Another would be gender. One of the things that drives me crazy about Disney movies, Disney cartoons, movies, whatever they're so full of these tropes. Like it's just like every time you see it, the fainting princess, the heroic, do whatever. And so we got our 2-year-old hooked on Moana. Has anyone seen Moana? Love Moana! You know why? There's no love interest in Moana.
Yeah.
No love interest. It is a young girl who's going on an adventure despite of her 2 living parents. Have you ever noticed in Disney movies, parents are always dead? Right? Typically mom, right? And parents are, the kid is off on their own doing this. No, this young lady's having an adventure. She, meets a little kooky dude. Everybody has a little kooky mentor, right? And it has this, this beautiful adventure and does this stuff under her own power and influence by working with just powerful film. I bought the DVD, I downloaded the DVD, I bought the CD. I want to encourage Disney to make more films like that as opposed to the fainting princess stuff, right? So these obstacle illusions, these artificial barriers to authentic human relations. And so what we know, that a truer definition of diversity should be this balance between of our differences and our similarities. Right? I'm a college professor, so we get to write like this. Right? So a truer or better definition of diversity is this idea that is the relationship between our differences and our commonalities. And having both of those as a part of our conversation simultaneously. So when we look at who's at the table, I want to know who's at the table, but I also want to know who's missing at the table. Right? Recognizing the differences between those 2 things. So the next thing I'd like for you to do is, on that same page is there's a space there at the bottom of that page that I'd like for you to draw your family constellation, or more commonly kind of referred to as your family tree. Right? Your family tree. And if you could go back 3 generations, starting with yourself, and just go back 3 generations, that would be great. And as detailed as you can or you want to create, please do so. If you've been adopted, that counts, right? If you have separated yourself from your biological family and you've created another kind of family for yourself, that counts. If you come from a mixed or blended family, that also counts, right? So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to create your family constellation, your family tree, if you will. All right? As you look at those folks you're starting to create, I want you to put a star next to one or two individuals that people talk about a lot. That people talk about a lot in your family, whether they're good things that they talk about or bad things, right? Who gets talked about a lot in your family? Star next to that. Individual or individuals. All right, next to one of those individuals that you starred, can you put some, what are the attributes that are associated with that individual? What are the attributes that are associated with that individual? Like, why do they get talked about? Is it because they were a hero? Or was it because they were a scallywag? They were scandalous? What is it about them that makes them notable or talked about? All right, so now you have the person that you starred that people talk about. You talk about their attributes. Can you tell me, like, when those attributes were either developed or when those attributes were used? Where was the person? Like, were they in the country? Were they in a rural area? Were they in a city? Were they, when they developed these attributes, were they in a time of war? Were they outside of the United States? When those attributes were developed, where were they? All right? As best you know, as best you can tell. All right, and lastly, what time frame did were those skills developed, or those attributes that they're most noted for? What time frame was it so was it the 1950s, the 1940s? Was it the 80s? What time frame was that those attributes were either developed or used, or that they became most noted for? All right. What I'd like for you to do is get in groups of 2, and if we have to do 3, no larger than 3 though. So that gives everyone an opportunity to kind of share. And what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to share as much of your family constellation as you feel comfortable sharing, and don't share anything you don't feel comfortable sharing. All right? So I'll give about 5 minutes for that conversation. Then we'll debrief that conversation, and then we'll take a break. All right? So I'll give 5 minutes for that. So you can do some paired sharings, or if we have to do groups of 3, no larger than 3. All right? You have 5 minutes.
But anyway, so that's awesome. She's made a whatever it was. So I told my parents. So anyway, that's kind of fun. They're getting together. And I think that really it really has a I would say the war was in the 40s. Getting into himself was probably there you go. So the one that I my mother go back up to me, I kind of So that was a real
raised somewhere else. Yeah, if you take it back.
Five, four, three, two, one, and game over.
There you go.
Game over. So I want to say thank you so much for taking a risk and sharing some very personal things with your discussion partner. I will ask that whatever you shared, that you keep it in the context of this conversation, that folks can feel that kind of personal information they share with you is in the conversation in this particular bubble at this particular time. It might be a little messy if I start reading about my family member on Facebook because of this workshop, right? So hopefully that's a thought process that we're all kind of operating with and under. I don't want to hear about the other person, but I would like to hear about you. And so as you were going through this exercise, were there some things that you thought about or learned or discovered about yourself by going through this particular process? And if so, what were they? And if not, why? No. Were there some discoveries or things that you thought about, either about your family system, family members, or about yourself as you were going through that? Yes.
I was pretty shocked that I couldn't remember my mom's dad.
Okay.
He was alcoholic and that, and not really myself, and so I couldn't do that. I still couldn't do it.
Yeah. And so is alcoholism a valued thing in your family? No. Huh. Wonder why you can't remember his name. Other folks, are there things you discovered about yourself or? Yes.
I discovered that my sister is the only person in my family who has not been divorced.
Wow, your sister's the only person in your family that's not been divorced. All right.
That has been married.
Okay, that has been married and not divorced. Cool. So another hand, yes.
I just realized that there were no divorces.
You just realized that there were no divorces in your family.
From the parent to this parent.
All right.
And I see the genealogy of our family.
Uh-huh.
So
So you know.
I do know that.
Yeah.
But it just struck me odd as I was writing it down.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. Yes.
One of the things that we noticed was thinking about characteristics and the time frame. And one person was like, what life events maybe have led to different people. In the case of my grandfather, it's his events taking care of his wife that has a lot of positive characteristics. And then it's like, really, was he always that kind and gentle, way back when? I don't really remember, but it's definitely.
It's definitely
So
apparent.
thinking about the time frames and what makes it ways and
Uh-huh.
different.
Positive or negative. Yes, you had your hand up as well.
I just noticed when I was asking my grandparents, I don't know the single thing grandparents. So it's mom, dad, mom, dad, mom, dad, mom. I don't know.
Okay, so you don't know names. Okay, cool. Yes, and I'll take your hand. Go ahead.
Two things. One is that in both my family and in my husband's family, there are many more stories about the men than the women. And the grandmas are the story much more anointed. great grandparents and great grandparents, but I have much more of a sense of them.
Of those males.
Yeah.
You have much more of a sense of those
And their
males
stories.
and their stories.
And the other thing is that my dad is third generation from immigrants, and my mom's family was here way longer. And there are many more stories about the immigrants, and also on my husband's side. The immigrant stories are pretty vivid.
Pretty vivid. All right, cool. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's making me think about how I really need to, I grew up in a very small town in rural Iowa. And it's kind of going through this exercise in relation to what the conversation and the topic of conversation today is, that I really need to credit my parents for raising myself and my two siblings to be as open-minded as we were. When growing up in a small rural Iowa community, it could have been very different. And so I credit my parents for raising us to be open-minded and inclusive in our lives as we grew up and left in us.
Yeah. Other discoveries? Yes.
I kind of have the opposite of you, where I feel like I want a better sense of community in my family. And I think that might be because, like, my grandpa passed away before I was born, and most of my cousins were born. And it might be because I have just one sister, so it's pretty female on my side of the family. So my grandma's kind of the head of our family at this point on my mom's side. So I feel like I have more stronger women in my family than men, at least for this type of thing.
And may I ask, what was the conditions of your grandfather's passing?
He passed away from a heart attack.
Okay.
So he passed away relatively young comparatively. So he didn't die of old age.
Other pieces. All right. So my grandmother passed. It's been about 4 years now, and that hurt me deeply. That was my buddy, right? Or I was her buddy. However that worked out. Right? Her birthday was 7 days before mine, and so it was easy to remember her birthday. And we would do all sorts of things together. She loved doing puzzles. We would do paint by numbers. I don't know if anybody remembers doing that, right? We would paint by numbers. She played Yahtzee. She was a Toastmistress, had trophies and everything. And she loved to bowl. Like, that was her other thing, right? So she was like this really well-rounded person. And loved her to death. Loved her to death. She wore white gloves and pearl necklaces and that kind of stuff. Even when those weren't like in fashion, that was still her thing. And breakfast for her was tea with sausage. I mean, the whole deal, right? Tea with toast. That was breakfast. Or sometimes she would splurge and we'd have English muffins, right? And but my grandmother would do these odd things, these strange things that I actually thought were quite disgusting. So she didn't like jelly and she didn't like jam. She liked preserves. And so she would get the preserves out. So we'd have, Saturday morning breakfast or Sunday morning breakfast, and she'd bring us to the table, and she'd get out the preserves, and she'd have the tea set up and the toast or the English muffins out or whatever, and then she would get out her preserves, and sometimes she would open up the preserves, and there would be this fuzzy stuff in the preserves, right? Yeah. And so what my grandmother would do is she'd take a spoon and she'd scoop out the gray stuff, throw it away, and then serve the preserves. That's disgusting! Ah! Or she'd make us lunch. She liked Braunschweiger sandwiches. I don't know if you know Braunschweiger, right? And so they would cut. She would go get the Braunschweiger, put it on the bread, and she'd add cheese to it. And so she would go into the refrigerator, and every so often the cheese would have mold on the cheese. And my grandmother would take her knife and cut off the pieces of mold, slice up the cheese, and put it on our Braunschweiger sandwiches. Disgusting! Until she died. So when my grandmother passed, it was funny. I got to hear all these stories about her growing up, and I missed it. I had no idea why she did those strange and bizarre things. Stacks of newspaper. Never understood why I couldn't get my grandmother to get rid of these stacks of newspapers. She would also wash out plastic bags, Ziploc bags, and reuse them. I was like, just throw it away and just buy some more. But why did my grandmother do those things? She grew up in the Great Depression. Context is everything. One of the things that we're oftentimes missing in these cultural competence discussions is the context. If I don't understand the context, then I don't understand the behavior, even if I can identify the behavior. I can identify my grandmother's behaviors. They seem obtuse, they seem weird, they seem strange until I recognize the context. The funny thing about context is we didn't raise ourselves. We didn't raise ourselves. We come out of a context. We're developed, we're raised in a particular context. And can I be held accountable for another context that I've never been introduced to? I would say no. However, we can experience and we can learn about other contexts because we're now adults and we have something called Google. So if you don't know something, you just ask Google. Just ask Google. All right? So context is everything. So I hope you've written that down because we'll come back to this idea of context being everything. We recognize that context is geographic, right? So depending on where you grew up, you will only have certain kinds of experiences, right? So only growing up in Florida, you can't know about ice fishing. I mean, you can have an awareness, but you don't know what the joy of that experience is if you've only lived in Florida, right? We know that and the funny thing about it, about geography or context being geographic, is that geography also changes over time, right? So the dinosaurs are not here. Why? Why did they die? What's that? The Big Bang? Why did they die? There's a big meteor, and it changed what? It changed the atmosphere, it changed the environment, it changed the geography, right? So as geography changes, so does context. We also recognize that time consistently moves forward, right? So time is constantly changing, so the context is constantly changing. Governmental systems drive the context, right? So if we were, the great thing about being in the United States is that we can have a conversation like this, right? I would suggest that probably I haven't lived in a communist country, so I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that conversations like this are probably not happening in a communist country, right? And actually a socialist country would have a different conversation than what we have, right? And then our education system. For right now, our education system is such that we guarantee that all youth participate in the education system. Not sure how long that will last, the way it currently it currently exists. But in other parts of the world, people can't say that, right? People either pay for education or have to get scholarships, or missionaries go out to educate because government systems don't find that necessarily, can't afford it or don't have the value of education. So we know that context is constantly changing, and that context is everything. We didn't grow ourselves, and that this context contributes to these optical illusions of race and gender roles. It really plays into that. So if I understand the context, I can understand the behavior. So let's do this. Let's take a 7-minute break at this point. You feel free to fill up on coffee, use the restrooms, and we'll come back at about 12 after. All right? All right, see you then. Thank you so much.
set it up, I guess. Have you done this very similar? Yeah, we've done similar. We did see last year.
We're not telling ball.
No, we're not. Tell them to tell you, you don't have
Okay, no, I think we're comfortable in here.
I didn't.
Okay, all right, but if, you know, if
Mine
you
came
want
out.
to do something that goes wide open.
Okay. Good to see you.
Yeah, so that's in my brain, so I would.
No. It's my first time here.
Yeah, so that's in my head today. No, I didn't transplant that, so that's what I.
Yeah, it was a building set up in the 80s, so, still have that 70s
Yeah.
feel to it, all my stuff is on my stuff.
But yeah, going to Charles Hall and seeing how people come into schools and all that, really appreciate it. I do appreciate it. I don't know, I think if I was okay, yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, so I was in there.
Where'd you guys live? Here?
Yeah. You go up there,
So are you with the other one? Okay, we just call holiday.
yeah.
This is something
Yeah, so then she had said that.
we've been doing this, right? We're talking about how we approach the work and maybe some opportunities down the road for users
Yeah, most of my approaches psychology. This is something that the real thrust is to try to get away. But I can't go straight to the heart. Right. So, I try to even use the exercise with that heart to solve it. Yeah. Yeah. So, I've heard that. Yeah, once you get to see somebody tired, or show you them yours, they're more apt to show you theirs. Well, great, Andre. Well, thanks for,
Real excited, I'm glad that people find value in it. Took time and
sold out, which is good. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you, it works so many.
It's like that.
Yeah, those cardboard. Yeah. Yeah, they have a little. Oh, right, yeah. Right,
Sweet.
well, I know, I've seen some of those. Put it on your chair, and it's like the ball, but it's just like half done. And it's just enough where, yeah. Like the bird pop. You know, and you have trouble sitting still, but it's just good and it's not distracting from everybody else.
Well, I had.
I remember that.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to say thank you so much. I think we're doing a good job so far. Any questions, comments, observations people have at this point? Any questions, comments, observations? Cool. We'll keep rolling. If you'd like, if you can just pull up your smaller handout. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the motivation behind this idea of this context, right? And this idea that we didn't raise ourselves. So our loved ones, our guardians, our providers, were actually trying to give us the best they had given what was available to them. So I want to talk about some truths about human beings. So let's get into that. So there are 4 truths about human beings. The first is that human beings can learn, change, and grow. Many of us would not be in the business that we're in if that was not something that we believe to be true, right? Who I am today is not who I was at 17. Thank God. Right? So we can learn, change, and grow. Even if we don't see evidence of it, we know that that is a true statement. Right? Anyone do any gardening or agriculture? All right, cool. When you plant a seed, do you check on that seed every 15 minutes? No. Why?
Nothing's happening.
Because nothing's happening?
Underneath. But you can't see.
Ah. So it doesn't happen that fast, right? It is a process, right? And you don't
It's
check.
not visible.
What's that?
It's not visible.
And it's not visible, right? It's not necessarily visible to us. But we know that it's a process, and for the most part, all things considered, we water it, we give it sunshine. What do we do with the process? We trust the process, right? We trust the process. So when we talk about, motivations of boards, of co-workers, what we have to recognize or the question we have to ask is, do we trust our process? Do we trust our process for hiring? Do we trust our process for disciplinary action? Do we trust our processes? Because when we do, we have faith in those processes that they will do what they're supposed to do. It's funny, I was at NPR's conversation last night on the development of human potential. They're doing this thing, and they were talking about the community's interaction with the police, right? And that was their thing. So we're at this, I'm at this meeting and I'm listening to all this stuff, and I think that it's very interesting because they talked about all these negative, people giving these negative stories about policing, and people kept saying that policing as it is enacted today is a broken system. I don't believe that. I don't believe that it's broken. I believe that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But we no longer trust the process, trust the system. And so, because when you look at the numbers of discriminate or disproportionate realities of people in their interaction with the police, that can't be an accident when it happens all over the place. This is the way the system is designed. And so I was trying to encourage them to stop talking about it being a broken system because it's not broken. And let's talk about how do we recalibrate or create a new system because it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. But all human beings can learn, change, and grow, even if we don't see evidence of that. We know that that can happen. I'm sure that as a young person, you had some attributes, some behavior, some mindset that your parents thought that you should change. For me, it was dragging my feet. I don't know why, I don't know how, but I used to walk and I drug my feet. It drove my parents crazy. Until I started buying my own shoes and my own pants. I stopped dragging my feet. So now I know what they meant. Right? So there's that. People do what they think works, even when what? Even when it doesn't work. But why do they do it in the first place? Because they think that it works. Well, and what is fueling that belief?
Always the way we've done it.
Because it's always the way we've done it. What else? Maybe power and privilege.
It's the only option they know.
It's the only option they know. And what else? What's that? They trust the system.
They're not evaluating the end result.
They're not evaluating the end results.
Benefit from it.
Because it's hard to change and they benefit from it. County jails are full of criminals and I love it. I love when criminals get caught. Love it. Because they always get caught. Love it. Why do criminals get caught? I'm talking about career people who run scams, who do all this stuff. Why do they get caught? Because what? They think it'll work what?
All the time.
All the time. All the time. But it fails to work because the context changes. Somebody gets hip to what they're doing. Right? It was funny, I'm on the board of ACAC, and we had it was published, so I can talk about this, right? So it was published. We had someone in our accounting staff who was siphoning off money. 2% here, 2% over there, blah, 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 siphoning off money. Didn't even know. And for years, 5 years, they did this, 5 years. Get sick. Calls in. Can't come in today. We get somebody else to replace him for the day. And the person's like, oh, wait a minute. What? Hey, what? If the person hadn't gotten sick, guess what? She probably would have done it for another 5 more years. Right? I love it when criminals get caught. Love it. Right? Because they fail to recognize that the context changes. Right? Context changes. Next is that all human behavior is goal-directed, meaning I don't necessarily believe in altruism, that people just do stuff because it's a good thing to do. I always look at what are people trying to get out of the situation. Right? I see it in the news all the time. Shiny thing over here. We're passing a law over here. Anyone seen or read the autobiography of Malcolm X? Watch the movie. It's a good movie. Even better yet, read the book. right? So there's a scene in the movie where, it's also in the book, that's why the movie's so long, because they tried to mirror the book as much as possible. And so there's a scene in the movie, and Malcolm is giving his last speech. And so he's talking to the group and whatnot. And on the right side of this auditorium, a man yells, "Get your head out my pocket!" And so what does everybody do when they hear that? They turn and look. And everybody's turning and looking, and the assassin comes from this side and kills him unabated. Right? So all human behavior is goal-directed. So we have to ask ourselves, so what is the goal of the behavior? And so when one of the things that we know is that during the O.J. Simpson trials, as America is watching that, we are passing laws that take away all of the boundaries of the telecom industry, that take all the regulations off the financial industry. And as we're concerned about OJ and the white Bronco, they're doing all these other things here. And the similar things happen with Michael Jackson case and all these other things. Shiny objects. Look at the shiny object and you won't pay attention over here, right? One of the things I think is interesting about the Trump administration right now is that they have so many, they have thrown so many balls in the air that people are chasing all of this stuff and don't even really know what each other is supposed to be doing. And I think that is a strategy that one could have to try to enact some policy. But I think there are people coming around to recognize what this game is that maybe needs to be played out. So that's important, that all human behavior is goal-directed. And that lastly, attitude is a reaction to goals. Attitudes are reactions to goals, or responses to goals. What have you been taught about an attitude? What have people told you an attitude is? So that's what I'm offering, but prior to having that, how did people explain or talk about this idea of an attitude to you?
Bad.
That is bad, that you can have a bad attitude, right? And typically when you had a bad attitude, and typically adults do this, what were they encouraging you to do? To comply. What else? To change your attitude. Right? What else? To get rid of your attitude. Right? And my dad would say, so my parents were college educated, but we made them unintelligent. Like we drove them crazy. Right? So, there was 4 of us, or sometimes 6 of us, when we were taking in foster kids and that kind of stuff. But we would make our parents like stir crazy. My parents would like forget our names. Right? Like, Andre William Davies! Crystal, get over here! And all that kind of stuff. Or my dad would, for the first 7 years of my life, I thought my name was Boy. Because my dad was like, "Boy, stop that! Boy, get over here! Boy!" Right? I thought my name was Boy. And he would say strange stuff, right? He'd say, "Boy, I don't like your attitude. You better fix your face." And so I would. He didn't like that. I don't know. He didn't like that, so he sent me to my room, right? But my mom, she cut straight to the chase, and she would say, "Boy, I don't like your attitude. Go to your room till you get your act together." And so I go to my room. I get my act together. I opened up the door, stepped halfway out into the hallway. To be or not to be? I spent a lot of time in my room. But that wasn't what they were talking about. And it wasn't until I was 17 that I finally got this idea of an attitude. And this is what I figured out when I was 17. So my dad was my pastor. So growing up, my dad was a Pentecostal preacher. He was a Black Panther who had a conversion experience and became this Pentecostal preacher. And as a result, we would go to church on Sunday all day. 7:30 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. We stop at 3 o'clock for chicken, not because we're black, but because chicken is delicious. All day church on Sunday. So Friday night, I asked my dad for the car. My dad loves me. What does he say? He says, yes, he loves me. Right? So I get the keys from my dad. I pick up my friends. We're cruising for girls. I don't know what would have happened had we found girls, but we're cruising for them. And I come home before curfew. I fill the car with gas. I give my dad the keys. And he says I have what kind of an attitude? I have a good attitude, right? So Friday night, my dad and I are cool. I have a good attitude according to his standards, right? Sunday, my best friend Dexter calls me at noon and says, Andre, can you pick me up for the movies? What do I already know about Sunday? It's church all day. But I'm 17. I'm invincible. And Jesus is my friend. So I go to my dad and I say, Dad, can I borrow the car? What does my dad say?
You've got a bad attitude.
I got a bad attitude. He says no. And not only does he say no, but he gives me the hell sermon. In our household, the worst consequence you could ever experience was going to hell. And either you could go to hell on your own, or my dad would show you the way. As a result of that conversation, I would say my dad had a negative attitude. And what would he say about mine, conversely? That is also negative. So what actually is it that drives an attitude? What drives an attitude? Feelings? Context? Wants? Preconceived notions? How close to your goal you are. All right, anybody have a teenager in your life? Anybody remember being a teenager in your life? Teenagers come up to an adult and they say, adult, can I be? Go do. And the adult says, no. What's the attitude? You get an eye roll, you get right? But then the adult says, you know what? It is great for them to go do these. Well, yeah, no, they can go. What happens to the attitude then? It changes. So when we talk about attitudes, what we're really talking about is this idea of goal achievement. So if I have someone who has a bad attitude, before they open their mouths, before they express what it is, I already know something about them. Which is what? They're not reaching their goal. There's a goal that they're not reaching. And so then I can be helpful to them. Because what's the easiest way to help someone to have a good attitude? Help them reach their goal. Help them reach their goal. But what if their goal isn't something I can help with, or it's not something they could handle, or maybe it's even illegal? Then what becomes my responsibility to them? Help them find a new goal. Because if I give them my goal, the success and failure is tied to whom? It's tied to me, as opposed to them. Right? So ultimately, what are humans, what are we after through all of our behaviors, through our mindsets, through our cultures? What are we trying to get? There are three things that Alfred Adler, the building maturity, would suggest that we are trying to get. And that is the fact that we are looking for significance. That we're looking for belonging, and we're looking for safety. Significance says that I'm a person with purpose and power. I was born on October 30th, but I was definitely a treat. It was not a trick. Right? So I was born on purpose. And that purpose is either something that I can declare, or the universe can open it up for me. Oh, this is your purpose. Right? So I get to decide that. But we're all looking for this idea of this significance, that we have a sense of purpose. We can do something. We're powerful. We can engage. Next is this idea of belonging. And belonging suggests that I am in relationships with people who understand my significance. I'm in relationships with people who understand my significance. So when we talk about this idea of belonging, I would suggest that your friends probably understand your significance, even when your family doesn't. We surround ourselves. We want to be in relationships with people who understand our purpose, who understand our power, what we can do. Right? And then lastly, this idea of safety. We want to be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually safe. To be in relationships with people who understand our significance. So we're all looking for that. So when I see a person with a bad attitude, I know that one or a combination of those three things are missing. And if I can help someone achieve those things, I have a friend for life. I have a friend for life. All right? So let's go back to that original handout with the 5 circles. And you will see that there is a big circle. That there's a big circle there. And let's call that the circle of all human knowledge. Yeah! Okay, too much mega mind. No, let's call it the circle of all, the pie. There it is. Let's do the pie of knowledge. All right? So inside the circle is everything that can be known about the human experience. Everything that can be known. What I'd like for you to do is to cut yourself a piece of pie relative to the size of everything that there is to know. All right? So cut yourself a piece of pie relative to the size of everything there is to know. What do you know of everything there is to know? All right? All right. So what are some examples of things that you know? What are some examples of things that you know?
I know how to knit.
Oh, you know how to knit. All right, cool. Someone else.
You know how to supervise people?
You know how to supervise people. All right. One more.
I know how to cook.
You know how to cook. Great. Give them a hand. Give them a hand. Right? We all know something, and something is contained in that circle. So that is what we know. What I want to do now is cut a second piece of pie. And the second piece of pie is the size of what you know you do not know. What you are aware of that you do not know. So for example, I know that I do not know Mandarin Chinese. I know that I don't know how to fly an airplane. And I now understand that I should not be doing lobotomies. That's nice. Yeah. So what are some things that you are aware of that you don't know? Now, I will suggest that there is a third piece of pie that is contingent on the second piece of pie. So quantify that second piece of pie as best you can, because there will be a third piece of pie. All right? So what are 3 things contained in that piece of pie? What are some things you know you don't?
How to knit.
How to knit. Please raise your hand if you know you don't know how to knit. Because we know who to go to, right? 2 more. Things you know you don't know that are in your awareness.
Calculus.
Calculus. Please raise your hand if you know you don't know calculus. Or if you knew it, you no longer use it enough to remember. Yeah, okay, good. All right. One last one.
Flying an airplane.
Flying an airplane, and what else?
Being a mechanic.
And being a mechanic on a flying airplane. All right, great. So it's obvious that there are things that we know we don't know. And what do you think the last part of that circle is? What you don't know, you don't know. Or we will call that a blind spot. We'll call that a blind spot. And if we take in consideration all 3 of these pieces, we'll call this whole thing a paradigm. And a paradigm is simply the way you see the world. Paradigm. Paradigm. The way you see the world. Anyone ever received a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy? Yeah. When you get that fourth, fifth, or maybe even 10th generation of the copy, does it look exactly like the original? Why? Or how does it look different? So it's degraded a little bit. What else? It's fuzzy, it's distorted, it's picked up stuff from every other copy, maybe it's lint or hair or whatever, dirt, and it degenerates. So the copy that you receive when it's gone through that process is not the same as the original. Whose responsibility was it to introduce us or give us our first paradigm? Our parents. Our guardians, our caretakers, right? Now, where did our caretakers get their paradigm? From their parents and from their caretakers. And from society. And where did those people get their paradigm? From the same. Right? Now, here's something that's very interesting about this. So the paradigms that we receive may be out of context. Maybe out of context. Because context is constantly changing, right? Context is constantly changing. Here's an example of what I mean that paradigm may be out of context. Some of us may have relatives who have called Brazil nuts by another name. Some people have no idea what I'm talking about. So Brazil nuts are they're this little wedge-like nut, usually around, you see them largely around holidays, the winter holidays, right? And it's dark brown mahogany Brazil nut. And there's another name for that. Anybody want to say the name? What have you heard them called? Nipper toes. Now, I do find it interesting that my family never called them that. That's about. And then I wonder, like, the people who came up with this term, were they podiatrists? Like, what was their, like, how did they get to equate those things? But the people who called them that, did they invent, the people that that called them that, did they invent that word or the definition or how those things are called? No, they didn't. It was a part of their context. And so we say, grandma, grandpa, we don't call those that anymore. We call them African American toads. I'm just joking. Bad joke. Right? But we have to recognize that paradigms and how we see the world is contextual. And as context changes, so must other things. Right? As context changes, so must other things. So I have a farmer in Minnesota. Anyone have relatives that are in agriculture at all? Who grew up in towns or places where there's agriculture? Okay. Is there a certain amount of knowledge that those agricultural folks needed to have to be successful? All right. So what are some of the things they needed to know about the soil? Right? So how to plant, how to make sure that the pH is right in the soil and whatnot. What else might they have to know? Weather, right? So what weather conditions can do to the crops and the plants and when to plant and when to harvest. One of the things that I hate about gardening myself is I ruin broccoli every year because I never know when to pick it. Anybody ever grown broccoli? Oh, yeah. Right? And it's like, it's like, is it this week or, and I wait till it gets yellow and I'm like, I missed it, right? So knowing when to harvest, if you have animals, you can't just take them down to HCMC, right? You got to figure out how to help the animal, even if it means putting on that long glove and cleaning out the stomach, and all that kind of stuff, right? So you got to know how to do that stuff. You have to be part-time mechanic to fix your equipment because you're not calling in or taking stuff in all the time, right? So there's lots of things that this agricultural farmer has to recognize about their craft. So they have lots of knowledge about that. But let's say that farmer leaves the farm in Minnesota and ends up in New York City. What will the New Yorkers, or what could the New Yorkers say about this particular farmer? That he's a hick, he's country, that he's ignorant, backwards, naive, that he's from Green Acres, I lost half of it. So they might call him ignorant, they might call him backwards, they might call him all sorts of things. But what if the New Yorker left New York and ended up on this farmer's land in Minnesota? What can the farmer then say about that he's a city slicker? What else can he say about it? That he's ignorant, right? And he may go as far as to say what my granddad would say about a dog that doesn't hunt. What do you do with a dog that doesn't hunt? You shoot it. I'm not suggesting that you shoot it. You shoot it. But I do find it interesting that all of my grandfather's dogs ran away. But context is everything, right? So when we talk about this idea of IQ or cultural IQ, the thing that we typically don't take into account is that the context is everything. And so when I have immigrants that are coming from, East Africa or West Africa or from the Middle East, one of the things we have to be mindful of is that they're coming from a different context, right? Now, can the farmer get used to living in New York City? Yes. Can the guy from New York get used to life on the farm? Yes. What's the gap between his arrival and his ability to adapt to that environment? What is that gap called? Time. Too long. Yeah, time. So given enough time, our immigrant communities, our refugee communities, they'll adapt. They just need enough time. Just like many of our grandparents had the time to do that. So when we talk about this idea of cultural competence and all that kind of stuff, we have to recognize that context is extremely important. So let's look for an eraser. And I want to talk about this idea of culture, because culture is extremely important and valuable. So let me erase part of this stuff. Any questions, comments, observations at this point? No, I think that's another marker, but you got a tissue.
You're adapting well.
Thank you. Thank you. Given enough time. As Jeff Goldblum says, address. Yes.
No, people are saying like only adapt to what is exactly like here.
Yep.
And I don't know if that's necessarily true. And then I think it's more than time. I think people need more stuff than just time.
Yep.
So
No, your point is very well taken. And what I'm suggesting is from a broad humanistic approach. Because I agree with you that they do need more than time. They need resources and access to goods, job services, and money. We'll talk about that when we talk about this idea of intersectionality. What was the other point you just made? Adapting to what is normal. And what I'm suggesting is that that in terms of engaging with an environment, there is a degree of adaptation that has to happen, not necessarily assimilation, which is different, right? Yep. So no, I'm glad you brought that up because other people may walk around with that. But there is, and I would suggest that there are many ways in which we adapt to the context. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to assimilate to what is already existing, right? And are people noticing? Do you recognize those differences between those two things, right? So assimilation says I need to decrease who I am to become more of what already exists. Where adaptation are just the methods by which there are many methods of adapting to the context that I'm in. So if another example of adaptation as opposed to assimilation is that if I am in, no, this is a great one. So when I taught high school, I had a number of different kinds of students in my classroom, right? And I remember one of my high schoolers was a Somali young woman, and she was catching the bus, and she was on the bus, and an older white lady asked her, she said, "Aren't you hot?" Because she had on her job, and loose-fitting clothing, and was very well covered, because that was her thing. And then the young lady responded to her, she was like, "Ma'am, I'm from Africa. Africa is hot." So here we have this conversation happening where and she may in fact be hot, or she blah blah blah, but she's choosing not to assimilate to American culture by changing who she is. Although she's riding a bus, which is an adaptation that she did not have in her home country. Right? So there's a difference between those things. Thank you so much for helping me clarify. Right? And you had your hand up as well. Okay, same point. Okay, good. Yeah.
Well, at least in my family, assimilation is generational, more than one sometimes.
Yeah. And assimilation is one of these ways that the paradigms get practiced, right? That the best way to engage this context, I mean, there are different. And it's funny because there are different approaches to how to deal with this idea of context. One is to be like the people you're going to, right? And we'll talk about how that is dehumanizing in just a second. Is to be just like the people in the context. Others are to, I'm not going to be able to operate in this context, so I need to be as different from that context as possible, right? So let me just go there. So because what's related to context is this idea that there is a direct ratio between context and culture. And that as context change, so does culture. So culture and context are inextricably tied. There's a racial relationship. So as context changes, so does culture. So the context of this Brazil nut was a particular context, and now we have a new context, so that's not a part of our culture, right? It's not a part of our culture. So when we talk about culture, I like to use this. Has anyone seen the iceberg theory of culture? Anyone seen that? Right. So it's this. Those who haven't, is basically there is this iceberg, and then there's the 10% above, and then 90% below. And those are things that you can see about a culture. These are things that you can, right? I liked it. I thought it was useful for a time, not organic enough for me, right? So I like to use this carrot of culture. And so when we talk about the carrot of culture, there are two parts to the carrot, right? What would you call the green part above the ground? What do you call that? A stem, okay. So we'll call it the stem. And the lower part is the what? Okay, so it's either the root or the root, depending on where you come from. Right? My grandmother would say root. She'd also say ara. And she put lines through all of her settings. But, that was kind of too cool. So we have the stem and we have the root. Now, what is the relationship between those two parts of the carrot? So one cannot exist without the other. So what is it that the stem does for the root? So it feeds it sunlight. So it gets sunlight, and through photosynthesis, it gives its energy down to the root. Now, what does the root do for the green part? Extracts nutrients from the ground, right? So like water and minerals. And then what does it do? It stores the energy and gives it structure and feeds it right back to the stem. So they have a symbiotic relationship. So they need each other to survive, right? They have a symbiotic relationship. So let's call this green part, or the stem, the artifacts of culture. So these are the artifacts of culture. So these are the things that you can readily see about a culture. So give me some examples of things you can see about a culture. Trends, art, the way they dress, the food they eat, the language that they speak, dance and music, right? So all sorts of art forms. These are all the things that we can see about a culture. But then there are things that we cannot see about a culture. And what are those kinds of things that you can't necessarily see about a culture? What are some examples? Belief systems. Values. What's that? History. Motivation. So we'll call this bottom part, this root, we'll call the root values, right? And so, although I may be able to see families, but I don't know what gender roles are in that particular culture, right? How they, what is life and death? What does it mean to be alive? What does death mean? I can't necessarily understand or see how they associate their acumen of time or beauty or all those things, right? So what we have to understand is that the stem points me to what? When I see the stem, what assumption can I make? That there's a root, right? So when I see the stem of a carrot, when I see a carrot's leaves, I can make the assumption that there's a root under there, which is the carrot. So when we see the manifestation, the physical manifestation of artifacts, what do they represent? The values. So when I see an artifact, it is a physical manifestation of value. Example. So in the 90s, there was this group called Crisscross. I don't know if anybody remembers them or hearing them. And what did Crisscross want you to do? There were two things. They wanted you to jump, right? Crisscross and make it jump. They also did something that was very interesting at that time. And what was their other signature thing? They wore all their clothes backwards, right? They wore their clothes backwards. Now, simultaneously as this is happening, there's another trend that is also happening. And that is the trend of sagging your pants. So I find it interesting that 25 years later, people aren't wearing their clothes backwards, but they are sagging their pants. Why? Comfort? Doesn't look comfortable. It's easier to wear your pants, saggy pants, than to wear your pants backwards.
Where did you where that came from? I don't understand. And the value associated with
The context has changed. This is the value of sagging pants, and this is the value of wearing your pants backwards. So when you see sagging pants, what must you understand about seeing the sagging pants? It is a statement of values. What you're wearing today, although you look very fashionable, but the clothes that you're wearing today is a statement of values. So in our workplaces, on our boards, in our frontline staff, and our managerial staff, and our supervisors, the people that we see and the people that we don't see are a statement of value. They are our artifacts. It's funny, so Target gets slammed a lot because they don't have something called an affirmative action plan. So I was the affirmative action officer for Anoka County, so I did that paperwork and processed that stuff for the federal government. And I was surprised that Target did not have an affirmative action plan. Part of the reason Target does not have an affirmative action plan is because they have affirmative actions to hire. Wells Fargo, as much flack as they're getting a lot of flack for a lot of stuff. I love going into Wells Fargo banks. Why do I love that? Because in every bank I've gone to, no matter where I've gone, when I've gone into a Wells Fargo bank, it is like the United Nations rainbow up in the... Why? Because those are their artifacts. They're the manifestation of their values. So what happens when artifacts get disconnected from their values? What happens when that happens? So one of the things is that, so I was born October 30th, and I loved it as a kid, loved it, because I got the 3 C's: cake, candy, and costume. Like as a kid, that was the best thing you could get, right? So as a kid, I loved it. As an adult, I hate Halloween. I hate Halloween because it's the time where people can be the most misogynistic, racist, and xenophobic as they want to be as an excuse. I think that is our purge, right? So I'm in the bank, and I'm at Wells Fargo. I don't know why I mentioned Wells Fargo. I need to get some endorsements. But I'm at the bank, and there's a guy behind me. And I don't know if this has happened to any of you, but you know when somebody's trying to get your attention, like they're not trying to invade on you, but they want to get your attention, right? So I'm standing in line, and a dude behind me, he's like off to my side, and he's kind of like, and so I'm standing there and I'm like, okay, I'll write. And so, so it's kind of leaning like, hey man, how you doing? I'm good, man, I'm good. I'm good. Okay. Halloween costume? Yeah! He's got on this like big light blue polyester suit with the hem already stitched in, and in a big purple hat with leopard print around it, the stuff, and gold chain, fake gold on his thing, and so he's standing there. I'm like, so what's your costume? He said, he was like, what do you mean? What is my costume? I'm a pimp. I go, oh, okay. In my head, I'm like, this dude has never met a pimp. Because they don't dress like that. And I'm not trying to to glorify that, or because the other question I had, my second question was, why would you want to dress up as somebody who destroys human life or profit? Like, why was that even a consideration of something to dress up as, right? But what was he doing? Why was he dressing like that? Because he saw it on TV, right? He saw it in some movie, he saw it in some thing. And so what happens is, when artifacts get separated from their values, the artifacts become stereotypes. So what are stereotypes? They are artifacts that I don't know what the value is. I don't know how they're connected to the value. So I don't know if you've ever heard a stereotype and really ask yourself, well, isn't that true? Can't those people dance? Aren't they drunks? Can't they not jump? Right? Part of that is because there's an artifact that's been disconnected from its value. And then what happens when the stereotype is, or the artifact is disconnected from the value? If I'm gardening, and I accidentally rip off the head of my carrot, the top of my carrot, and I don't mark it or I don't pay attention to it, what happens when I go back to try to find my carrot? I don't know where it is, right? I can't find it. And so when artifacts are separated from their values, then we have this idea of lost culture. We begin to lose our culture. Right? Do you know what I call this X? Ellis Island. You know what I call this X? Refugee status. You know what I call this X? Undocumented immigrant status. Why? Why would I suggest those things you called that? Yeah.
Because you're cut off from your context at that point.
So not only are you cut off from your context,
But you're also cut off from your values.
from your artifact and your values, right? Artifact and values. So we know in Ellis Island that many folks got their names changed. They changed their names to assimilate, to be most like the people that they thought they could join. Many of them found huge failures in that strategy.
But a lot of them, it was that the workers in the immigration place couldn't pronounce their names.
Couldn't pronounce
So they make up a name for
Yep.
it.
One of the things I was doing some work with the Equal Justice Committee for the 10th District, and one of the things we were saying is that it would be really good for us to create all of our documents in other languages. So in a couple of Somali dialects, maybe Korean, Spanish, and that kind of stuff. And I said, that's good. No, those are good steps. What assumption are we making? That people can read in their own language. Okay? And so sometimes we jump to these things without thinking that maybe there's some disconnect to that. Now, there is also something that I think is problematic, and so these are carrots. That's my best. And this is a radish. And sometimes what happens is that people take these stereotypes and try to apply the tops of carrots to their radish. You know what we call that? Cultural misappropriation. I like using misappropriation as opposed to just appropriation, because when cultures rub up against each other, we appropriate all the time, right? We appropriate all the time. But misappropriation is saying I have no regard for the values of this artifact. And so that's where you see a lot of the Halloween stuff. You see a lot of the fashion industry really taking the core values and artifacts from cultural groups and trying to exploit them as fashion. I think it's very interesting. There was a post that a teacher put up. One of her kids had, what are those hard candies by Brock's? And they're really tart. What are those called? Not sweet tarts, but Jolly Ranchers. Jolly Ranchers. The kid had Jolly Ranchers in her hair, right? And that was, and the teacher made fun, put it on Facebook and said, you know, look how ghetto. People use that term ghetto, right? This child is, or the family is, blah, 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 blah. What the parents want to do with the kid's hair should not, you know, I really don't have any opinion on that, right? But I thought that was interesting. But then I saw another thing that it was like the cheapest thing, the hottest thing for men with beards was to take Christmas bulbs and put them in your beard. Right? They had a whole kit, a little mini Christmas thing, and it was like the hottest trend. And I'm thinking, what's the difference between this and this? Right? There's still whatever. So this idea of cultural appropriation is extremely important to recognize. So we have, so when we talk about this idea of creating diversity, it is our sameness and our difference. Equity is suggesting that we recognize all of this stuff as it relates to culture, and that culture constantly changes. And that when we don't recognize those, then we can succumb to these obstacle illusions. We can succumb to these obstacle illusions. So I'm going to pass out this handout. So we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so I want to, if you go to your smaller handout, just want to talk a little bit about the context that we're operating in, right? So context is everything. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. You ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Declaration of Independence, paragraph 2. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 1863, what happened? What happens in 1863? The Emancipation Proclamation is signed and delivered, and what does that do? It frees the slaves, predominantly slaves in the South, right? So I'm not sure if President Lincoln did that because of his benevolence or as a destabilizing factor for making sure that the South was never to rise again, but I'm glad he did it, right? So I don't know what his motivations were for that, but I'm glad that it happened. Okay? So in 1863, that happened. What happens in 1865? So the war is over, 1865. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to break you into 3 sections. So we'll do it like that. So 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is passed. And so along the back row, you'll be group 1. What I want you to do is I want you to look up the 13th Amendment of the Constitution on your smartphone, smart device. I'm sure somebody in there has that, right? I want you to talk about that, what that says, and then have one person be the reader, all right? So you get groups of 4, it looks like you have 2 groups of 4. Just kind of talk about that 13, all right? This group right here, what I want you to look up is something called, does anyone have a smartphone? You have a, okay, cool. So I want you to look up something called white codes. Look up something called white codes, all right? So, and then this group, I want you to look up something called black codes. And once you find that, I want you to have some conversations among yourself about what those things mean, and then have one spokesperson for your group, all right? So the same with you. I want you to kind of talk about what that means. I'll give probably about 3 or 4 minutes to do that. So look up white codes, have a spokesperson that can tell me what you find on white codes, and then the same with you. So the same 3 minutes, we'll let that go. So I'll see you in 3 minutes.
Pokemon comes from. No, look at white codes. Look up white codes. Otherwise you're gonna get like that. Yeah, Pokemon and color names. Right.
All right, stop. So, group in the back, we're looking up the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which comes right off the heels and wheels of the Emancipation Proclamation. What did you come up with? So what can someone read the 13th Amendment to the Constitution?
Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude such as punishment for a crime whereof the parties are endured convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
All right. So yeah, let's go back and read. Can you read that first part of the thing again?
Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude such as the punishment for a crime whereof the parties are endured convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction.
All right, so stop right there. So, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution says we will have no more slavery. Right? Huh. I had a bully growing up. I don't know if you had a bully growing up. And the bully would do goofy stuff, right? Make us line up, beat up one of us, and then make us all give him lunch money up and all that kind of stuff, right? So one day my bully got tired of being a bully. He said, I'm done being a bully. I will not be a bully. Except on Tuesday. Did he change? No. Why? Because he has an exception. Right? So when we talk about this idea of, this is why I made the suggestion earlier, and I tried to make it in that NPR thing, that the system's not broken. It's not broken. It's just got exceptions. Right? So let's talk about what those exceptions are, except for people with who have been duly convicted of a crime. So let's talk about this idea of white codes. So when you looked up white codes, specifically white codes, what did you come up with? Pokemon. Pokemon! Came up with Pokemon. What else did you come up with?
Color codes for graphic design.
Color codes for graphic design. CSS codes, right? Did you come up with any hospital codes? Anybody find hospital codes? Hospital codes. All right. Anything else you find for white codes? Black codes. Huh. So black codes. What did you find for black codes? What were black codes? Yes.
In the United States, the black codes were laws passed by southern states that in 1865 and 1866 after the Civil War. These laws had the intent and the effect of restricting African Americans' freedom and of compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt.
Wait a minute, no. What? They got free! In 1863, the 13th Amendment! United States freedom! And then what? Southern states passed laws in the same year. In the same year. This is our context. Context is important, right? So when we talk about, like this prison, the school to prison pipeline, or birth to prison pipeline, blah, blah, blah. This is what we're talking about, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Guess what hasn't been changed? We haven't changed this in the Constitution. It's just changed in more. Context is everything. If you don't understand the context, then you don't understand what's going on. So when we see this over-policing of certain kinds of groups, we have to understand that it's part of something that we have to recognize as contextual. Part of our time. August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is filed, which is what? 19th Amendment to the Constitution gives who the what? Women the right to vote. Right? Why was that necessary?
Was it because it's the men landowners in the South, or the men guys and the women with people in the company?
That may have been one of the pieces. What else is also happening? Now, I don't want to take away from my sisters. I'm glad my sisters got it, but I want you to also recognize there's a contextual piece to this. What else also happens that would encourage them to broaden their base? Women's suffrage.
More white people can vote.
Now more white people in general can vote. Not taking anything away from my sisters, but we got to look at this contextually. So now in the 13th Amendment, we have all these free slaves who can now vote. It's to the advantage to make sure that white women can vote too. Right? Not taking anything away from my sisters. Women's suffrage was important. The pantsuit nation needs to rock, right? But we have to keep that in mind, because these kinds of things start to interplay when we talk about this idea of intersectionality. And we'll come to that in just a second. And then 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act, or the Polk Act is signed. 1924 says that American Indians can be legal citizens of the United States without any other conditions. So before 1924, American Indians could, or Native Americans could be U.S. citizens by selling their land or saying that they withdraw from their tribal affiliations. That's how they could be so-called Americans until 1924. So let's keep going. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act is signed, and the Civil Rights Act does two things. What does the Civil Rights Act do? There are two things that it does. What's that? Voting. That comes in 65 and 67. Made discrimination illegal. So by the nature of suggesting that discrimination is illegal or outlawing segregation, it defines discrimination. So it does two things. So it outlaws segregation, making discrimination illegal, and it defines discrimination. So those are the two things. That's important. We'll come back to that too in just a second. So that's important. 1978. Native American Freedom of Religion Act is signed, saying or suggesting that Native Americans can now worship the way they want to without restriction. 1978, the nation built on religious freedoms. Native Americans did in 1978. Pause for the irony. 1990, Americans with Disabilities Act is signed, giving who what? Who was that designed for? People with disabilities. Interesting. How many of you intend to live a long life and get old? The ADA is for you. It's for all of us, right? So, because at some point, right, if you're lucky. Right? So those are important context pieces to recognize that these things add to the complexity that is this existence that we have in the United States.
They were already implied.
Go ahead.
In the original, in the Constitution. But then we have to pick out, oh yeah, and these are, but it says all men, meaning all people. I mean, except for the Right. But I mean, if you read that, if one comes from another planet and you read that, and you say, oh, well, all people are created equal.
Yeah.
But then now we have to go back to that. That's also true.
Because part of the problem is with, again, it's contextual, right? So given their time, given their geography, their education and orientation, they certainly. What was the biggest problem that posed the United States during the Revolutionary War period? What was the biggest challenge they had to face and deal with? Or question they had to answer?
Was representation of who owned the country, who ran the country.
Okay, so who owned the country, who ran the country? What was, they had a bigger problem than that. What was the problem? What was the problem? Slavery! Slavery was the problem. Why was it the problem? Because England was already doing away with slavery? What are we saying in 1776? How do we say we want freedom without giving everyone freedom? Now here's the thing that people don't want to admit or don't want to talk about. So the founders of our Constitution were who? Okay, they were white men. There's something more specific about them. They were land-owning, privileged, educated, slave-owning white men. Were there other white men in the country that did not own slaves, that were not educated, that did not have property? Yes, there were. Were they the majority or the minority of white men? They were the majority. So what did this minority of elite, land-owning, slave-owning, educated people have to do to maintain and keep their power and privilege? Create a system that benefits them by what? Keeping slavery and what else? What do I do with these other white men who don't have what I have? Yes.
Giving them privilege and opportunity to move upward in society by giving them rights.
Giving them a paradigm that says you can be just like me. If you keep the status quo going. Right? This idea of meritocracy. This idea that you can rise above the bootstrap, use your bootstraps to pull yourself up. That doesn't even make sense. You ever tried to pick yourself up by picking up your shoe? Doesn't work. right? So yeah, so this idea of slavery. And this becomes then the template for how we even talk about humanity as a whole, how we talk about immigrants, how we talk about people who we perceive to be different from ourselves. So I'm looking for one more copy of my thing. Did I pass it out? Oh, it's here. So I told you I was born in 1970, and they did some strange things in the 70s as regards to how they did the birth and the decisions around that kind of thing. So one of the things that they did that was kind of interesting was when I was born, the doctor hung me upside down and he slapped me. Right? And guess what I did as a natural response? I smacked the doctor back. That's actually an old Richard Pryor joke and the only one I can tell. So the doctor hands me over to the nurse, and the nurse does something that changes my life. She looks at her checklist and she's going down all the steps. So how much I weigh, how long I am. She puts my little foot on a little piece of paper, like a little stamp and that kind of stuff. And then she gets to the part of the paper that changes my life forever, which is race. And in Dayton, Ohio, there were 3 opportunities that she could have chosen. Three choices. Black, white, and other. So she looks at her list, she looks at my parents, she looks at me, she looks at my parents, she looks at her list, she looks at me, and she makes her choice. And what choice do you think she made given what she chose? Yeah, she chose black. Sometimes I fantasize about what it would have been like to have been something else. But I'll never know because that didn't happen, right? It was just a fantasy. But the thing that I also wonder is, before she made her choice, what was I? What were you before you became Scandinavian? What were you before you became white? What were you before you became Hmong? Before you became Native? Before you became Somali? What were you before those categories were applied to you? You were born human. I was born human, but America made me black! Right? And so we constantly do this. We fall into these false paradigms, these ways of seeing the world that are contextual, that culture is built around that. And what is culture trying to get at again? It's trying to get safety, significance, and belonging. It's trying to say this is how you get safety, significance, and belonging. These are our best learnings of how you get safety, significance, and belonging, how you get to these values. That's what culture tries to say. And so we have a culture in the United States that is very much obsessed with violence. We were birthed out of violence. Somebody said to me once, as a girlfriend said to me that I didn't marry, a girlfriend said, the way you get me is the way you'll keep me. Couldn't keep it up like that, right? Yeah. No. So we're born out of violence. We're born out of being anti-king, right? We don't want a king. We love everybody else's king, but don't give us a king. Right? I know more about Princess Diana than I did about Mrs. Reagan. Right? I did myself. At any rate, so that's what culture does. Culture is an adaptation to the context. It is telling us these are the best ways to deal with the context. But what happens if your context is messed up? What if there's something wrong with your context? If your context is jacked up, what's going to happen to your culture? You're going to have a jacked up culture too. And the people that are in that culture are going to act in what kind of ways? Jacked up ways. Right? So when we talk about that, that's important. So I was born human, but America made me black. Right. If I was born someplace else, I might have a different identity, cultural or racial identity, given on where I came from. Right? So on this page, it looks like it kind of faded out. I apologize for that. But I want to talk a little bit about the EEO. So the Equal Opportunity Commission, I used to work for Anoka County. I was responsible for doing this and working with HR to talk about these categories. Many of you are in HR, have relationships with HR, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I wanted to think about the fallacies that are in the definitions that the federal government has to use. Now, one of the things I did, I was working with an attorney in one of the two major cities, and I made the statement, and they said that my statement was a false statement, and I went back to them, and then they apologized because they recognized the fallacy of their logic, right? So this attorney said, I made the statement that in the United States, we have defined racial categories. And the attorney said, no, we don't. The problem was the attorney was thinking of protected classes. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a different kind of thing, but we'll get to that too. So these are the racial categories. Now, I want you to listen to the logic of the United States government as it tries to define human existence, right? So here we go. EEO-1 reporting. Now, this is for private companies. So the government has a different one called the EEO-4 report, but this is for companies that you oftentimes probably do business with on a day-to-day basis, right? So for-profit companies. Employers are required to attempt. What does it mean to attempt? Try. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Employers are required to attempt to allow employees to use self-identification to complete the EEO-1 report. So they're required, they have to allow the attempt. Okay? So if an employee declines to self-identify, employment records or observer identification may be used. So have you ever heard someone say, well, I'm not putting down my race, my ethnicity. I'm not playing this game. I'm not going to be a part of that. Guess what? You don't have to be a part because somebody else is. Right? So if in my county, if you didn't put it down, guess who got to put it down? I did. And I may have no idea what your background is, but it's what you look like to me. Right? So we'll continue on. So race and ethnic designation as used by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, who is what? Equal Opportunity Commission is who? Who is that? It's the government, right? So they're not using anything. So if I'm a general and I decide I want to go left with my troops, and all the other troops are going right, what happens to me as a general? I get left behind, and ultimately, what's going to happen if that keeps happening? I'm going to get fired. They're going to get rid of me, right? We haven't gotten rid of this stuff, which means what? It's supported, right? So we'll keep going with it. So race and ethnic designation is used by the Equal Opportunity Commission do not denote scientific definitions of anthropological origin. Can somebody give me that in English? It's not based on anything. And particularly it's not based on science. Right? It's not based on science. So what are they suggesting to us? What are they trying to tell us? If it's not based on facts, if it's not based on science, what is it based on? We made it up. They're suggesting that this is made up by them. Right? So let's see what they made up. Hispanic or Latino. Not Latino, but anyway, or Latinx, but Latino. A person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture of origin, regardless of race. Regardless of race. Interesting. Did you know that there are no Hispanics in Mexico? In Mexico, what are Mexicans? They're Mexicans. When they come here, they become Hispanic. But in Mexico, they're Mexican. What's the point of me making that distinction? We define, right? We get to make this label out of our context and our culture and for our particular reasons or rationale. Next, American Indian or Alaskan Native, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, who maintain cultural identification through tribal affiliation or community attachment. There's a lot of qualifiers under here, right? What are a couple of those qualifiers? So first, I have to do what? Maintain cultural identification, and then I have to do it through two ways, which is what? One of two ways, right? Through either tribal affiliation or community attachment. And what was the goal of the boarding school? To kill the Indian and save the man. Which is the opposite of how we identify what it means to be Native American in the United States. Let's keep going. Asian. A person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. Anybody know people from any of those countries? Do they look alike? No, they don't look alike. And what about people who aren't in any of these specific countries, but whose people groups go across these countries? Okay? Like the Hmong. Part of the problem with people understanding first of all, do people know why the Hmong are here? Why are the Hmong here in the first place? Was it the Vietnam War they were our allies in? See, the Hmong were our side chick. Anybody know what side chick is? There's a white and then there's the side chick. That's the Hmong was our side chick. So the Vietnam War was a girlfriend. But the secret war in Laos was a side chick. We couldn't tell anybody that we were doing it. So as a reward, we said, because you guys helped fight the secret war with us, we'll let you and your descendants come on in. Right? Now the funny thing is, when they get here, what do we do on their present? Excuse my vulgarity, but we pee on their present. We make it almost to the point where people say, well, why did I even sacrifice to come to this country when you invited me and you treat me so bad? Right? I think it's interesting. Do we know why Liberians are in the country? Why are Liberians in Brooklyn Park? Because of the war situation at home? Oh, they decided.
They were given a choice.
By who?
The person that was picking them on the boat.
Liberia is our love child. It's our daughter country. America had a baby and it's called Liberia. President James Monroe succumbed to a lot of the pressure that people had and offered and sent and mandated, in some cases, people to go back to Africa. So after being Americanized, they sent these Africans back to Africa to a place called Liberia. What does Liberia sound like? Liberty. Guess what their capital city is called? Monrovia. After James Monroe. So when they get into a civil war, what do you think caused the civil war that they could have been having back in their home? Who do you think the civil war was between? The people who were already there and the people that we sent back. So why wouldn't we help clean up this mess that we created? And is it just a coincidence that the Somali have found the Twin Cities as their home? Is that just an accident? No, it's not an accident. There was a civil war happening, and we said, we don't want it to go down like that. We want it to go down like this. You help us, and what will we do as your reward? We'll send you to safety. We'll bring you to us. Part of the problem with this context is that if you know the context, you understand the behaviors. If you don't understand the context, you don't understand the behaviors. You don't understand the culture. We don't want you to know the context. Because we want you to just look at the behaviors. So in our organizations, when we start thinking about who's at the table, who's not at the table, we got to recognize what is our context and what is our culture that supports the context that we have. What are artifacts? How do the people around the table represent the goals and the missions of our organizations? Do we have carrots with radish tops? Are we saying we want one thing, but we're not manifesting the thing that we say that we want in our organization? So how do you just looking at a couple of questions, how do you get your board in line? You start telling the truth with your board. This is what we look like, and this is what we say. How do we close that? Or do we want to close it? Right? How do you talk with people who are resistant to some of these changes? The understanding this context and this culture and in these artifacts. Well, we also have to recognize is that as these paradigms are being formed, there are three parts of our brain that are at play. So part A is what I would call I wouldn't call it, but scientists and researchers suggest that there's this piece of our brain called the reptilian brain. The reptilian brain, its responsibility is to seek out danger. To see if something, among some of the other things. So the other thing that it looks for is it looks for mates. So if I cannot procreate, right, is this thing dangerous? And I'll do whatever I can to survive, right? So our primal brain is this ancient reptilian brain. Then there is the secondary part of our brain, which we'll call our mammalian brain. And that is where we start to do critical emotional thinking about what our primal brain is saying, right? This is where the seat of the emotions kinds of are. How do I feel about what my primal brain is saying to me? And then lastly is the C part, which is the prefrontal cortex or the neocortex. And it's referred to the neocortex because it's the newest part of our brain, the neocortex. And this is where executive functions happen, right? So when we talk about this idea of context, well, we have to remember that context is related to culture, and culture is all about adapting to making sure that we get our significance, our safety, and our belonging. So our primal brain is looking for danger. Our context and our culture is trying to help us get safety, significance, and belonging, right? So when we make decisions and we have a clear head, which part of our brain do we use to make those decisions? Is it the primal brain, our mammalian brain, or our neocortex? Neocortex, right? So when our brain is clear. But when our brain isn't clear, the primal brain hijacks the whole system. So when I see the other, when I am fearful of the other, when fear is used to manipulate or to change my behavior, then my mammalian brain is engaged and I'm not thinking clearly. We saw this best example in the 2016 presidential election. There are people who voted against their very own best interest. Yes, I hate Obamacare. But don't touch my ACA. They said, I hate Obamacare. But don't touch the Affordable Care Act. Same thing. Right? Same thing. So when I can represent these things, then I can change your behavior. So how do we get over this kind of, and this is where implicit bias lives. It lives in this small part of our brain, the reptilian brain, right? So, and it's so funny because culture plays such a huge part in fueling this, right? So when we think about, let's just do a word association. Kind of test. What is the white light fluffy cake called? Angel food cake, right? Angel food cake. What is the dark chocolate dessert called? Devil's food cake. Interesting. When people pass away or they die, what color are we supposed to wear to represent their passing? Black. Right? Particularly in maybe more even specifically in Christian cultures of either birth or new life or weddings. What is the color that's supposed to represent, particularly in Christian context? What color is supposed to represent that birth or new life? White. When we start thinking about this idea of keeping someone off the list, or we have a negative list, what is that negative list called? The black list. And when the lie is supposed to be good, even though we're not supposed to tell lies, but if we were to tell a lie that was a good lie, it is said to be a white lie. The game of pool. The objective of the game of pool is to do what? So first the white ball knocks all the balls off the table, and all the balls that are on the table have a color, but you only win if you knock which ball off last? The black ball. Now I know you're like, Andre, you are stretching this way too far, but I want you to think about how institutional these cultural icons become and how they're designed to stimulate not our critical thinking, but our reptilian brain. So how do we get over this? So one of the things that I talked about last night at the forum was because I don't like it when people use this alone. So people were using this this word implicit bias. Have anyone ever heard of implicit bias? Right? So they use implicit bias. Police officers need to work on their implicit bias. And I said, no, they don't. So again, I grew up in the '70s, and there was a TV show on called a comedian had a show, and his name was Flip Wilson, right? And I think it was the Flip Wilson show, but I can't remember specifically. But I do remember this because I had this doll, and Flip Wilson had this character that he would play on his sketch comedy called Geraldine. And I had a doll. I don't know why my parents got me this doll, but on one side was Flip Wilson, and he would cross-dress, kind of like Milton Berle, right? And so he would cross-dress, and he would be the character Geraldine, much like Tyler Perry and Medea, right? So it was that day's version of that, right? And so she had this catchphrase. Now, the thing, if you wanted to be successful in the '70s with the show, the key was getting the right catchphrase. Right? So, example. What you talking about, Willie? Right? What show is that? Different Strokes. Right? Hey! Fonzie from Happy. Right? That's a catchphrase. So she had a catchphrase. And her catchphrase was, "The devil made me do it." That was her catchphrase. The devil made me do it. And for whatever reason, we thought that was really funny back in the '70s. It usually given a rousing applause, right? What is she suggesting by saying that the devil made her do it? She's not responsible for her own behavior. She's not responsible for her own actions. So when people say, "I am suffering from implicit bias," the devil made me do it. Now, I want to tell you, I tried that with my parents once. Andre, why did you do that? The devil made me do it. My dad cast him out. We're going to pray that devil out of you, son. No, that doesn't work. You run a light. The cop pulls you over and says, "I'm going to give you a ticket." You say, "Officer, I have implicit bias. I didn't see that." It doesn't work, does it? Right? So what do we need? We need cognitive awareness. So if you're going to use the word implicit bias, that's cool. But you also need to talk about cognitive awareness. You need to be aware of your biases. The problem with this blind spot is not having the blind spot. It's not knowing that it exists. Drive your car. Not know where your blind spots are. What's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to cause an accident, or you're going to be in the accident. Right? You get a rental car. One of the first things I do is what? Adjust the mirror so I can see. I have to look for these blind spots that I don't know exist. I have to tell the truth about the context that I come from and how my culture is reflective of the context that I come from, and that this culture is driving me to get significance, safety, and belonging. And yes, these things get written in my subconscious. They get written in my primal brain. My primal brain says, "Use the bathroom." I got to use the bathroom. And I said, "Okay." You know, my humanity says, "Go to the restroom." My primal brain says, "Go." My humanity says, the neocortex says, "Go to the restroom." Right? So right now I'm trying to teach my 2.5-year-old to be human. Right? So she still is in the diaper stage, or the random stage, and all that stuff, but I'm trying to teach her how to be human. And so when so I gave you a homework assignment that I want you to do, which is the bottom part of that page. And what I want you to do, again, this is your homework assignment, is to think about all the groups on the left, and what did they try to teach you, or what were the conversations they tried to have about the categories across the top? And if those conversations were positive, or if they tried to teach you something positive about that, put a plus in the corresponding box. If they tried to teach you something negative, put a minus. If it's never anything we talked about, it's a zero. And you can have pluses and minuses in each of those boxes. So that's your homework assignment, all right? Once you do that assignment, what you'll recognize is that there may be some places where you need to get more information. There may be places where you've gotten misinformation. There may be places that you want to explore, that you want to change. And so this becomes your framework for doing that. The last thing, last couple of things, I just want to make sure you look at my list to address these questions. Is if you go to the center of your you go to the center of your handout, there are a couple of mental models I want to talk about. This idea of intersectionality, again, I'm more than one thing. In the cultural group that I'm in, there are many facets to my personality, to my humanity. So a couple of mental models we want to talk about. Implicit bias and systemic oppression. Implicit bias is the passive way that systems operate to oppress people. Right? So it's the passive way. It's not active. We're not actively pursuing folks, but we're allowing implicit bias to be the excuse by which we continue oppression. There is no such thing as reverse discrimination. You'll hear people say that. Discrimination is a verb and it is also a noun, and you cannot have a reverse verb or a reverse noun. There's no untable. Right? There's no reverse table. Right? So what we have, though, is discrimination. And we have the feeling that people have that they're being discriminated against. And what I would suggest is that anytime you have to perceive that you're giving up power, that can feel like oppression. That can feel like oppression. Right? Even when it's not, it can feel like it. Particularly when we have this model of there's only so much pie. Has anyone ever heard someone say that? You know, I have to get my piece of the pie because there's only so much pie. Life is not pie. Don't let people trick you into a false analogy of what life is. Life is not pie. Life, according to Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park 2, always finds a way. Right? So there's that, this idea, and there's these false choices that also have to be made between Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, or Blue Lives Matter. It's a false choice. All are true simultaneously, but for different reasons. Don't let people make you have to make false choices around that. We just talked about this idea, this concept of black and white, that it is designed to get into our psyche to make us make illogical decisions based on our own fears. Diversity oftentimes gets linked with low standards, and that's not what we're going for. That we have to lower the standards to have more diversity, or having diversity lowers our standards. There's not a correlation between them. What it does offer us, though, are different standards. We may have to be different if we want folks to come to the table. Micro-inequities is this idea of discretionary effort. Again, I like balance. So micro-inequities are all those small things that I can't sue about. Right? I can't sue about the fact that my coworker is looking at me in a way that's not uplifting. Or my coworker is looking at parts of my body as they talk to me, but never to my face. Right? I can't sue about that, but those are micro-inequities, and they diminish discretionary effort. Discretionary efforts is the willingness I have to give 100%. And when I'm not feeling respected, I'm likely to give less effort than I would if I was being respected. Right? So discretionary effort is up to the discretion of the individual, given the context that folks are operating in. And then lastly is this idea of racial orthodoxy. And I fault Senator Clinton for this, or she is a great example of this, racial orthodoxy, because the beginning of her campaign, what was her slogan? Anybody remember? Ready for Hillary. Does anybody remember that? It's not that long ago. Right? So her first set of slogans was ready for Hillary. Now the reason I find fault with that particular slogan is because that sounds like it's coming out of the middle of a conversation. Right? Ready for Hillary. So what was the first part of the conversation before we got ready for Hillary? What's the suggestion by that slogan?
That Barack Obama was just playing the soundboard.
So we got a black man. Now we're ready for a woman. Right? At least that was the implication. As I looked at that, that's what I read. That's what I heard. Why does that play into the racial orthodoxy? Because we have this stuff that our culture is set up that there's a way you're supposed to do stuff. And at first it's supposed to be white men, then it's supposed to be black men, then it's a woman, then it's a Hispanic, then it's an Asian, then it's a Native American, and then we start over at the beginning, right? Look at our organizations. Who are the decision makers in most of our organizations? What do our organizational charts look like? They follow a lot of this racial orthodoxy kind of stuff. Most of the diversity in our organizations is at the bottom. Racial orthodoxy. We have to challenge that. Why aren't we looking like who we say we say? Right? Is that, and we just need a paradigm shift. We need a paradigm shift. Lastly, and I'll just leave you with this idea of bigotry, prejudice, and discrimination. How do you get over this stuff? We know that the law said that they will take care of discrimination, which means that if we're not in an HR role, if we're not a lawyer, then we're not charged with dealing with discrimination. They are. However, we can play our role, and our role is to change the hearts and minds of people. And we do that by identifying that bigotry is not a lack of information, but a lack of emotional connection. Archie Bunker, he had tons of information. And no matter what you would say to Archie, he would dig in and say, look, meathead, I don't care what you say, this is how I feel. So bigotry is an emotional state. Prejudice is frozen thinking, it's frozen thoughts. And how do you recross thoughts? You ask critical questions. So how do you deal with someone who is resistant to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? You ask them some questions about their assumptions. You start asking those people questions, they start melting down and start breaking down. They're like, danger, Will Robinson, danger! All right? So there's that. And then discrimination is a set of behaviors. There's in the school of psychology, in psychotherapy, there's this concept of cognitive behavior therapy that says emotions plus thoughts dictate behavior. And the same thing applies right here. Emotions plus thoughts dictate behavior. So bigotry is emotion, prejudice is a thought, and discrimination ultimately becomes the behavior. Why do we still have discrimination? First of all, do we still have discrimination? Yes. Why? Because we haven't helped change people's thoughts and their emotions. So one of the questions that was here is, how do I stand up how do I recognize and ally with people of color? How do I do that? This is what people of color need you to do. I need you to stand up in spaces where I'm not spaces where I am. Because I can talk for myself. I can show up for myself. Thanksgiving. Show up. Holiday gathering. Show up. Question people who say crazy stuff. Don't bite your tongue. And even if you don't know what to say, ask questions with compassion. Right? Like really, I want to understand where you're coming from because I don't see it that way. Or where did you get this information from? How do you know that? Are there other news sources that say something different? Right? We're in a space right now where you can find anybody to agree with their foolishness. Whatever you want to believe, you can find it. Right? So just want to go through. Yeah. So there's that. Other question. Yeah, how do we manage our own bias? We take responsibility for these blind spots. We take responsibility for understanding our paradigms. We continually grow, we challenge. We do that homework assignment that we just gave you, right? That's one way that we do it. And then lastly, how do we get our board on the same page? I did talk a little bit about micro inequities and microaggressions. Microaggressions have many forms. Or micro inequities have many forms. Aggression are those things that are the small slights when you walk in the room, people stop talking, or they laugh, like, all that kind of stuff. Then there's micro invalidation, and that's where you ask people like goofy questions like, where are you from? No, really, where are you from? Right? So that's saying you're not validated in this space. So those are little small things that decrease discretionary effort. That's it. Thank you. I am a about 5 minutes over. If people want to stay and ask questions or need questions answered, I'm more than happy to do so. Any questions? Comments? Observations? Well, before you go,
There's a very good movie, I think it's called Skin. Did you ever see that movie? It takes place in South Africa, and it's about a girl born with and everything that she has to go
Thanks, sir. Thank you. Pleasure. Yeah, it's that. And then we get, how about you two decide where we go? Where you can go. All right, fair enough. Meet back here in all right, meet back here in 5 minutes. Okay, then we decide. Everybody take their bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a number of ways in which you can work. But what you saw today is our philosophy. It really is an along the context is changing, we'll always be inadequate in changing context. And we're trying to get the best we can to execute our lives and to collaborate. Well, I will say that I am able to approach my topics with a spiritual foundation, but I'm not able to with a so now students can go on to the ties directly to spiritual foundations that they can understand.
Yeah, I'm starting to.
I have no, but thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So how is this shift going on in your organization? So on the front end here.
Well,